The red rocks stood like ancient sentinels against the endless azure sky, their weathered faces carved by centuries of wind and sand. The desert stretched beyond the horizon, a sea of sage and dust broken only by the occasional Joshua tree reaching its gnarled arms toward heaven. In the distance, the dry canal bed snaked through the valley like a serpent skeleton, its stones bleached white by the merciless sun. Sarah Mackenzie wiped the sweat from her brow as she stood in the doorway of her father's trading post, watching the heat shimmer rise from the earth. At 19, she had spent most of her life in this forgotten corner of the Arizona Territory, where civilization ended and the wild began. The locals in the nearby mining settlement had taken to calling her the shy frontier virgin, a title that made her cheeks burn whenever she overheard it whispered behind the flour sacks and mining supplies. Her father, Thomas Mackenzie, had built the trading post 15 years prior, when Sarah was barely old enough to remember their journey west from Missouri. The log structure stood alone at the crossroads between the mining town of Copper Creek and the vast Apache lands that stretched into the mountains. It was a life of isolation, punctuated only by the occasional visits from prospectors seeking supplies or traders passing through with their wagon trains. Sarah's days followed a predictable rhythm. She rose before dawn to tend the chickens and gather eggs, then helped her father prepare the store for the day's business. The shelves were stocked with everything a man might need in this harsh land: pickaxes and shovels for the miners, bolts of calico for the few women brave enough to venture west, sacks of flour and beans, ammunition, and bottles of whiskey that disappeared faster than anything else. "Sarah, check the water barrels," her father called from behind the counter where he was tallying the previous day's receipts. "We'll need to haul more from the spring tomorrow." She nodded, pulling her sunbonnet low over her face as she stepped into the blazing afternoon sun. The water barrels stood in the shade of the building's overhang, their contents already warm despite the early hour. As she lifted the lid to check the levels, a movement in the distance caught her eye. There, atop a ridge perhaps a quarter-mile away, sat a lone figure on horseback. Even from this distance, Sarah could tell it was an Apache warrior. His silhouette was unmistakable, the long black hair flowing free, the rifle held casually across his lap. The patient stillness of one who belonged to this land in ways the settlers never could. Her heart began to race, though whether from fear or something else, she couldn't say. The Apache had been peaceful for several years now, but tensions were rising again. Just last week, a group of miners had come through with stories of cattle stolen and a freight wagon burned near the Salt River. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the violence erupted again. The warrior remained motionless for several long minutes, and Sarah found herself unable to look away. Then, as if sensing her gaze across the distance, he turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge, leaving only a small dust cloud to mark his passage. "Sarah, what's keeping you, girl?" Her father's voice startled her back to the present. She quickly finished checking the water levels and hurried back inside, her mind still on that solitary figure against the sky. The afternoon brought the usual collection of customers, dust-covered miners spending their meager earnings on tobacco and coffee, a traveling preacher who purchased a new shirt and stayed to share gossip from Tucson, and old Martha Hennessy from the boarding house in town, come to buy fabric for new curtains. "You hear about the Henderson Ranch?" Martha asked as Sarah measured out 3 yards of blue gingham. "Apaches run off with 20 head of cattle. Bill Henderson swears he's going to ride out with his boys and get them back, but his wife's beside herself with worry." Thomas Mackenzie looked up from his ledger. "Bill Henderson's a fool if he thinks he can take on the Apache with just his sons. That's a job for the cavalry." "Cavalry's 3 days' ride away at Fort Grant," Martha replied, her weathered face creasing with concern. "By then, those cattle will be in Mexico. Mark my words, this is how it starts. First cattle, then horses, then—" She glanced at Sarah and lowered her voice. "Well, we all remember what happened to the Oatman family." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped the fabric in brown paper. Everyone knew the story of the Oatman massacre, a family attacked on the trail, The parents killed, the daughters taken captive. It had happened 20 years ago, but people still spoke of it in hushed tones, a cautionary tale of what could happen to those who ventured too far from civilization. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah helped her father close the store. They ate their simple supper of beans and cornbread in companionable silence, the only sounds the distant howl of a coyote and the wind rattling the shutters. "You were quiet today," her father observed, pushing his plate away. "Something troubling you?" Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "Just tired, I suppose." Thomas studied her with the keen eye of a parent who knew when his child was holding something back. "You stay close to the post, you hear me? These are uncertain times. I don't want you wandering off alone, especially not toward the hills." "Yes, Papa." But as she lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the vast silence of the desert, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the Apache warrior on the ridge. In her dreams, she saw him again. But this time he was closer, close enough that she could see his face, angular and fierce, with eyes that held the wildness of the untamed land itself. She woke to the sound of her father loading his rifle, the metallic click of the lever action sharp in the pre-dawn darkness. "What is it?" she whispered. "Thought I heard something by the corral. Probably just a coyote after the chickens. Go back to sleep." But sleep wouldn't come again. Sarah lay still, every sense alert, as her father's footsteps faded into the night. The silence stretched on, broken only by the familiar sounds of the desert, the rustle of a pack rat in the walls, the distant bark of a fox. Then, so faint she almost thought she imagined it, came the sound of drums. The rhythm was steady and hypnotic, seeming to rise from the earth itself. Sarah had heard it before on still nights when the wind was right, carrying the sound from the Apache camps hidden in the mountains. Tonight it seemed closer, more insistent, as if calling to something deep within her soul. Her father returned after a few minutes, apparently satisfied that no immediate danger threatened. But Sarah remained awake, listening to those distant drums until they faded with the coming dawn, leaving her with a strange yearning she couldn't name and a certainty that her quiet, predictable life was about to change forever. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, growing larger as it approached the trading post. Sarah shaded her eyes with her hand, counting 6 riders moving fast from the direction of Copper Creek. Her father emerged from the store, rifle in hand, watching the approaching horsemen with wary eyes. "That's Jake Morrison's bunch," Thomas said, recognizing the lead rider's distinctive black hat. "Wonder what's got them riding so hard." The riders thundered into the yard, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Jake Morrison, a burly man with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. "Mackenzie," he barked, "you heard the news?" "What news?" Thomas kept his voice calm, though Sarah noticed his grip tighten on the rifle. "The Garrett party was hit yesterday, 10 miles south of here. Apaches killed 2 men, wounded 3 more, burned their wagons and made off with everything. Horses, supplies, the lot." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She knew the Garretts. They'd stopped at the post just last week to water their animals and buy provisions. Mrs. Garrett had admired Sarah's needlework and promised to send fabric from California. "Anyone else hurt?" Thomas asked. "The women and children made it to Murphy's ranch," Morrison replied, accepting the dipper of water Sarah offered. "But this is the 3rd attack this month. We can't just sit back and let these savages terrorize decent folk." The other riders had dismounted and gathered around, their faces grim beneath the dust and sweat. Sarah recognized most of them, miners and ranchers from the surrounding area, hard men who'd carved out lives in this unforgiving land. "What are you proposing, Jake?" Thomas's tone suggested he already knew the answer. "We're calling a town meeting tonight. Every able-bodied man needs to be there. It's time we took matters into our own hands. The Army's useless," Morrison spat in the dust. "By the time they get here, those murdering heathens will be long gone. We know where their camp is, up in Devil's Canyon, A dozen good men could clean them out in one night. Sarah saw her father's jaw tighten. That's reservation land? Jake, you go up there with guns blazing. You'll bring the whole Apache nation down on us. Maybe that's what it'll take. One of the other riders interjected. Drive them all back to Mexico where they belong. The men continued arguing, their voices rising with each exchange. Sarah quietly retreated into the store, her mind racing. She thought of the warrior on the ridge, wondering if he was from the camp Morrison spoke of. The thought of these angry men riding into the mountains with their guns and hatred made her stomach turn. That evening, Thomas prepared to ride to town for the meeting, his face troubled. Lock the door behind me, he instructed Sarah. Don't open it for anyone except me. I'll knock 3 times, then twice. Papa, you don't think they'll really attack the Apache camp? Thomas paused in checking his pistol. Jake Morrison's got a lot of influence in town, and folks are scared. Scared people do foolish things. He holstered the weapon and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Don't worry yourself about it. Cooler heads will prevail. But as Sarah watched him ride away in the gathering dusk, she wasn't so sure. She'd seen the look in Morrison's eyes, the hatred that burned there like a fever. The hours dragged by. Sarah tried to occupy herself with mending, but her fingers fumbled with the needle. Every sound outside made her jump. The creak of the wind in the rafters, the scurry of desert mice. As full darkness fell, she heard them again, the drums from the mountains, steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. Unable to sit still any longer, she stepped outside, staying close to the building. The night was clear. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled silver. The drums seemed louder now, joined by what might have been singing, though the distance made it impossible to be sure. A movement near the corral caught her eye. Her heart leaped into her throat as a figure materialized from the shadows, tall, moving with the fluid grace of one who belonged to the night. It was him, the Apache warrior from the ridge. Sarah stood frozen, unable to run or scream. He approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, and stopped a respectful distance away. In the moonlight, she could see his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that reflected the starlight. You shouldn't be here, she managed to whisper. He tilted his head slightly, and she realized with surprise that he understood her. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. Your people gather for war council. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. They plan to attack my people. Again, a statement rather than a question. I don't know. Maybe they're angry about the raids. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. The raids were not our doing. Young warriors from the south, not from our band. But your people do not care to know the difference. They stood in silence for a moment, the space between them charged with strange energy. Sarah knew she should run inside, bar the door, perhaps even fire her father's shotgun into the air to scare him off. Instead, she found herself taking a step closer. Why did you come here? He studied her for a long moment before answering. I have watched this place. You and your father. You are not like the others. You do not shoot at us when we pass. You leave water at the spring for all who thirst. Sarah was startled. She and her father had indeed maintained the spring a mile from the post, keeping it clear and accessible despite Morrison's demands that they poison it to keep the Apache away. Water belongs to everyone, she said simply. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. This is Apache belief also. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. The warrior melted back into the shadows so quickly, Sarah almost doubted he'd been there at all. She hurried inside, her heart pounding, and had barely slid the bolt home when her father's knock came, 3 times, then twice. Thomas entered, looking haggard, his face drawn with worry. How was the meeting? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice normal. Bad. Morrison's got them all worked up. They're planning to ride out at dawn, hit the Apache camp hard and fast. He slumped into a chair. I tried to talk sense into them, but they wouldn't listen. Called me an Indian lover. Said maybe I cared more about savages than my own kind. Sarah poured him a cup of coffee, her hands shaking slightly. What will you do? Nothing I can do. I'm not riding with them, that's for certain. This will only bring more bloodshed. He looked at her sharply. You look flushed. Are you feeling well? I'm fine. Papa, just worried. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the drums, which seemed to have taken on a more urgent rhythm. She thought of the warrior's words, that the raids weren't the work of his band. She thought of the women and children in that mountain camp, sleeping peacefully, unaware that death was riding toward them with the dawn. The drums continued through the night, sometimes distant, sometimes seeming to come from just beyond the walls of her room. They spoke of ancient things, of a time before the white men came with their guns and greed, when the desert belonged to those who understood its ways. As the first pale light touched the eastern sky, the drums fell silent. Sarah rose and peered out her window to see a line of riders heading toward the mountains, Morrison and his vigilantes, armed for war. Her heart sank as she counted them. 15 men, maybe more. She thought of the warrior's face in the moonlight, the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he'd spoken to her. Somewhere in those mountains, he and his people were about to face a storm of lead and hatred. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The dust storm struck without warning 3 days later. Sarah had been drawing water from the well when the sky turned an ominous yellow-brown on the horizon. Her father, still troubled by the events of recent days, had ridden to Murphy's ranch to deliver supplies, leaving her alone at the post. The wind hit like a physical force, driving sand and grit with stinging fury. Sarah struggled to secure the shutters, her skirts whipping around her legs as the storm intensified. The chickens squawked in panic, and she barely managed to herd them into their coop before visibility dropped to mere feet. She stumbled toward the trading post, but the wind knocked her sideways, disoriented in the swirling dust. She realized with growing alarm that she'd lost sight of the building, the familiar landmarks, the corral, the water barrels. Even the massive cottonwood that shaded the yard had vanished in the brown haze. Panic rose in her throat. These storms could last hours, and people had been known to wander in circles until they collapsed. She pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, trying to breathe through the fabric as sand filled the air. A hand closed on her arm. Through the chaos of wind and dust, she saw him, the Apache warrior, his face partially covered by a bandana, his dark eyes visible above the cloth. Without a word, he pulled her against him and began moving with purpose through the storm. Sarah had no choice but to trust him. He seemed to navigate by instinct, leading her away from the trading post and toward what she gradually realized were the red rocks at the base of the canyon. The wind was slightly less fierce here, blocked by the towering stone formations. He guided her into a narrow cleft in the rock, a natural shelter she'd never noticed despite living here for years. Inside, the howling wind became a muffled roar. Sarah collapsed against the stone wall, coughing and spitting sand. The warrior crouched beside her, pulling his bandana down. In the dim light filtering through the storm, she could see concern in his expression. "Thank you," she gasped when she could speak again. He nodded, then moved to the entrance to peer out at the raging storm. "It will pass before sunset," he said. "We wait." Sarah became acutely aware of their proximity in the small space. She could smell sage and smoke on his clothing, see the intricate beadwork on his vest. He wore his hair long and loose, with feathers and small bones woven into several strands. "I don't even know your name," she said softly. He turned to look at her. "I am called Naichi. It means mischievous one in your tongue." Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. "I'm Sarah. I know." At her surprised look, he added, "The traders speak of the shy girl at Mackenzie's post." Heat rose to her cheeks. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the storm rage outside. Sarah noticed a fresh scar on his upper arm, the wound still pink and healing. "The raid," she said. Your men came at dawn, as expected." His voice was neutral, but she saw his jaw tighten. "We were ready, moved the women and children in the night. When Morrison's riders came, they found only warriors waiting." "Was anyone killed?" "2 of theirs wounded, 1 of ours." He touched the scar unconsciously. "It could have been worse." "Your father was right. This brings only more anger, more killing." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I wanted to warn you. That night, after you left, I wanted to ride to your camp, but I didn't know the way. And my father—" "You have already done more than most would." He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. "This is why I was near your home today." She unwrapped it carefully, gasping at what lay within. A string of turquoise beads, polished smooth and strung on sinew, beautiful in their simplicity. "I can't accept this," she protested. "It was my mother's. She died when I was young, but she was a dreamer, a woman who saw beyond what is to what might be." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "She told me once that I would know when to give this away, that night at your trading post. When you spoke of water belonging to everyone, I knew." Sarah held the necklace up, watching the stones catch what little light filtered into their shelter. "It's beautiful." He helped her fasten it around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. The touch sent an unexpected shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. They talked as the storm raged on. Nietzsche told her of his people's ways, how they read the land like a book, finding water where others saw only dry rock, following the seasons and the herds. He spoke of ceremonies under the stars, of stories passed down through generations, of a way of life that was slowly being crushed by the encroachment of settlements and soldiers. Sarah found herself sharing too, her loneliness at the isolated post, her dreams of seeing beyond the desert someday, her love for the harsh beauty of this land that was the only home she'd ever really known. She told him about her mother, dead of fever when Sarah was 12, and how her father had never quite recovered from the loss. "He's a good man," she said. "He tries to be fair to everyone, Apache and white alike. That's why Morrison hates him." "Morrison hates because it is easier than understanding," Nietzsche replied. "This is the sickness that destroys both our peoples." As the afternoon wore on, the wind began to die. The terrible roar softened to a whistle, then a whisper. Nietzsche rose and checked outside. "The storm passes. I must take you back before your father returns." Sarah felt an unexpected pang of loss. These hours in the shelter, talking with him, had felt more real than her entire life at the trading post. But she knew he was right. They emerged into a world transformed. Dust coated everything in a thick layer of brown. Drifts of sand had piled against buildings and rocks like snow. The sun, low on the horizon, painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Nietzsche led her back to the trading post, both of them leaving tracks in the fresh sand. At the door, Sarah turned to face him. "Will I see you again?" He studied her for a long moment. "That is dangerous for both of us." "I know." She touched the turquoise necklace at her throat. "But perhaps some things are worth the danger." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "You are not what I expected, Sarah Mackenzie. Nor you, Nietzsche." He reached out and touched her face gently, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dust from her cheek. The gesture was tender, intimate, and over too quickly. "When the moon is full again," he said softly, "I will be at the spring." Then he was gone, disappearing into the lengthening shadows with the fluid grace she was coming to recognize. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the empty desert, her hand pressed to her cheek where he'd touched her. An hour later, her father returned, frantic with worry. He'd sheltered at Murphy's ranch when the storm hit, tormented by thoughts of Sarah alone at the post. "I'm fine, Papa," she assured him as he checked her for injuries. "I made it to the root cellar and waited it out." The lie came easily, too easily. She helped him clean up the worst of the storm's damage, all the while conscious of the weight of the turquoise necklace hidden beneath her high collar. When her father commented on her distracted manner, she blamed it on exhaustion from the storm. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the coyotes calling across the desert, Sarah touched the smooth stones at her throat and thought about full moons and dangerous possibilities. Outside her window, stars emerged from behind the last wisps of dust, bright and eternal in the vast darkness. Somewhere in the mountains, drums began their ancient rhythm, and for the first time, Sarah understood that they weren't calling to something savage or frightening. They were calling to the part of the human heart that yearned for connection across all boundaries. The same part that had led her to trust a stranger in a storm. The same part that now counted the days until the moon would hang full and bright above the spring. The days following the storm passed in a blur of routine tasks and hidden turmoil. Sarah went through the motions of her daily life, tending the store, cooking meals, mending clothes, while her mind remained fixed on the approaching full moon. She had taken to wearing high-necked dresses to hide the turquoise necklace, terrified her father might notice and ask questions she couldn't answer. Thomas Mackenzie, for his part, had grown increasingly protective. The failed raid on the Apache camp had only inflamed tensions further. Morrison and his supporters spoke darkly of calling in the territorial militia, of solving the Indian problem once and for all. "I want you to stay close to the post," Thomas told Sarah one evening as they closed the store. "No wandering off to pick herbs or gather stones. These are dangerous times." "Yes, Papa," Sarah replied, guilt twisting in her stomach. 2 weeks after the storm, she made a mistake. While helping a customer, Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard from town, Sarah reached up to retrieve a bolt of fabric from a high shelf. Her collar shifted, revealing a glimpse of turquoise. "My word." "Mrs." Pritchard exclaimed, her sharp eyes catching the flash of blue. "What a lovely necklace. Dear, I don't recall seeing it before." Sarah quickly adjusted her collar, her face burning. "It was my mother's. I found it while cleaning." The lie felt clumsy on her tongue, and she could see skepticism in the older woman's eyes. Mrs. Pritchard was the town's most notorious gossip, her tongue sharper than any Apache arrow. "How unusual," the woman murmured. "The beadwork looks almost Indian." "Many traders came through Missouri," Sarah said quickly. "My mother collected all sorts of trinkets." Mrs. Pritchard made a non-committal sound, but her eyes remained calculating as she completed her purchase and left. Sarah watched her go with a sinking heart, knowing the woman would spread her suspicions faster than wildfire. That evening, Thomas noticed his daughter's distress. "What's troubling you, Sarah?" She forced a smile. "Nothing. Papa, just tired." He studied her with those keen eyes that missed little. "You've been different lately. Distracted, jumpy." His expression softened. "I know this life isn't easy for a young woman. Maybe I should send you to your aunt in San Francisco for a while, until things calm down here." "No." The word came out sharper than intended. Sarah moderated her tone. "I mean, I don't want to leave you here alone. This is my home." Thomas sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if I've been selfish, keeping you here. Your mother always said you deserved better than this isolation." That night, Sarah heard the drums again, closer than before. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, counting down the days until the full moon. She pressed her hand to the hidden necklace and whispered a prayer to whoever might be listening, her mother's Christian God or Naichi's desert spirits, for the strength to navigate the dangerous path she'd chosen. The next morning brought trouble in the form of Jake Morrison himself. He arrived just after sunrise, accompanied by 2 of his men, their faces grim beneath their wide-brimmed hats. "Mackenzie," Morrison said without preamble, "we need to talk." Thomas stepped out of the store, rifle in hand but held loosely. "What brings you here so early?" "Jake, word is the Apache have been sniffing around the settlements. Tom Brennan saw signal fires in the mountains last night, and the widow Hartley swears she saw a warrior near her well." Morrison's cold eyes swept over the trading post, lingering on Sarah as she appeared in the doorway. "You seen anything unusual?" "Nothing. Thomas replied evenly. "Though after your raid, I'd expect they're keeping a closer watch on us all." Morrison's face darkened. "That's mighty sympathetic talk for savages who murdered innocent travelers. I sympathize with anyone trying to protect their families." Thomas shot back. "As I recall, your raid found no evidence linking that band to the attacks." "Evidence?" Morrison spat in the dust. "The only evidence I need is red skin and a heathen soul." Sarah saw her father's knuckles whiten on the rifle stock, but his voice remained controlled. "If that's all, Jake, I've got business to run." Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting on his pistol. "You'd best remember which side you're on. Mackenzie. When the real fighting starts, and it will start, there won't be room for Indian lovers in this territory." After they left, Thomas turned to Sarah. "Pack a bag. I'm sending you to your aunt's on the next stage." "Papa, no." "This isn't a discussion. Sarah, Morrison's working himself up to something bad, and I won't have you caught in the middle of it." Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. The full moon was only 3 nights away. If she left now, Naichi would think she'd abandoned him, or worse, betrayed his trust. "Please, Papa, give it a few more days. Maybe things will calm down." Thomas shook his head, but before he could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. A rider was approaching fast from the direction of town. Slumped low in the saddle, it was young Billy Garrett, one of the survivors from the attacked wagon train. He half fell from his horse, clutching his side where blood seeped through his fingers. "Apache," he gasped as Thomas caught him. "Attacked the stage. 5 miles north. They got everyone?" Sarah helped her father carry the wounded boy inside while trying to process his words. The northbound stage, that was nowhere near the Apache camps in the mountains. It didn't make sense. As Thomas worked to stop the bleeding, Billy told his tale in halting gasps. "Came out of nowhere. Painted for war. Never seen Apache like that before. Different markings." "Different how?" Thomas pressed. "White. White paint on their faces, like skulls." The boy's eyes rolled back as he lost consciousness. Thomas met Sarah's eyes, and she could see her own thoughts reflected there. The local Apache didn't use white face paint. That was the practice of raiders from Mexico. Renegades who answered to no chief and followed no treaties. "This will be all Morrison needs," Thomas said quietly. "He won't care about the difference. Any Apache will do for his revenge." That night, Sarah lay awake as the town prepared for war. She could hear horses and men gathering at the post, see torchlights flickering as riders came and went. Morrison had sent out the call. Every able-bodied man was to gather at dawn for a sweep of the territory. This time, there would be no warnings, no attempts at peace. This time, they meant to kill every Apache they found. The drums in the mountains had fallen silent, as if the desert itself held its breath for what was to come. Sarah fingered the turquoise beads and made her decision. Tomorrow night, full moon or not, she had to warn Naichi. Morrison's mob would show no mercy, make no distinction between guilty and innocent. She thought of Naichi's gentle hands fastening the necklace, his voice speaking of understanding over hatred. Somewhere in those mountains, he and his people slept unaware that death was gathering in the valley below, preparing to ride with the dawn. Her father had been right about one thing. These were dangerous times. But Sarah was beginning to understand that the greatest danger wasn't from Apache arrows or settlers' bullets. It was from the hatred that poisoned hearts on both sides, the fear that made enemies of people who might otherwise have found common ground. As the first pale light touched the eastern sky, Sarah made her preparations. She would wait until her father left with the other men, for surely Morrison would demand every gun he could get. Then she would take a horse and ride for the mountains. Consequences be damned. The full moon was still 2 nights away, but some warnings couldn't wait for perfect timing. If Naichi's people were to survive what was coming, someone had to bridge the divide between 2 worlds bent on destroying each other, and heaven help her. Sarah knew that someone had to be her. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the desert sky as Sarah urged her father's mare across the darkened landscape. She had waited until the posse departed at dawn, watched her father ride away with the others. his face etched with reluctance but bound by the obligations of community. Then she had saddled Buttercup, the gentlest of their horses, packed water and hardtack, and set out for the mountains. The turquoise necklace lay cool against her throat, no longer hidden beneath high collars. She had left a note for her father, knowing it would do little to soften his anger when he discovered her gone. But some things mattered more than a father's wrath. The desert at night was a different world. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, their arms reaching toward the stars. The sand, silver white in the moonlight, showed the tracks of countless creatures: kangaroo rats, coyotes, the sidewinding pattern of rattlesnakes. Sarah kept to the old trader's path, the one that skirted the edge of Apache territory, praying she could find the mountain camps before Morrison's mob arrived. She had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when the first shadow detached itself from a cluster of rocks. Her heart leaped, but it wasn't Naichi. It was another warrior, older, his face painted with streaks of red and black. "Stop!" he commanded in accented English, appearing to materialize from the very stones. Sarah raised her hands slowly, showing them empty. "I need to find Naichi. There's danger coming." The warrior studied her for a long moment, taking in her riding dress, the turquoise at her throat, the urgency in her face. Then he whistled, a sound like a night bird, and 2 more Apache appeared. They spoke rapidly in their own language, gesturing at her, at the necklace, at the direction from which she'd come. Finally, the first warrior nodded. "Come," he said simply. They led her off the main trail, into a maze of narrow canyons she never could have navigated alone. The horses picked their way carefully over loose stones and around organ pipe cacti. Above them, the canyon walls rose like castle battlements, blocking out all but a ribbon of star-filled sky. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, they emerged into a hidden valley. Sarah gasped at the sight: dozens of wickiups arranged in family groups, cook fires burning low, horses grazing in a natural corral formed by the canyon walls. This wasn't just a camp. It was a thriving community, hidden from the outside world. Dogs began barking at their approach, and people emerged from the dwellings. Sarah felt the weight of many eyes upon her, curious, suspicious, some openly hostile. Women pulled children back into the shadows, and several warriors reached for weapons. Then Naichi was there, pushing through the crowd, his face a mixture of joy and alarm. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" She slid from the saddle on trembling legs. "Morrison's coming. Not just him, he's gathered every man from 3 settlements. They're riding at dawn to kill every Apache they can find." Naichi gripped her shoulders. "How do you know this?" "A stage was attacked yesterday by raiders with white face paint, not your people. But Morrison doesn't care. He means to wipe out every Apache camp in the territory." The words tumbled out in a rush. "My father tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen. I had to warn you." An older man approached, his bearing regal despite his simple dress. Sarah recognized the bearing of leadership and guessed this was the chief. Naichi spoke rapidly in Apache, translating her warning. The chief's weathered face grew grave as he listened. When Naichi finished, the chief studied Sarah for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice deep and measured, with Naichi translating. "You risked much to bring this warning. Why?" Sarah touched the turquoise necklace. "Because hatred shouldn't be answered with more hatred. Because innocent people shouldn't die for the crimes of others. Because..." She looked at Naichi. "Because some things matter more than the color of our skin." The chief nodded slowly, then began issuing rapid orders. The camp exploded into organized activity. Women began packing. Men checked weapons. Children were roused from sleep. But through it all, there was no panic. Only the efficient movement of people who had practiced this too many times before. "We will move deeper into the mountains," Naichi explained. "There are caves where we can hide until the danger passes." "It won't pass," Sarah said urgently. "Morrison won't stop until he's driven every Apache from the territory. He's got the backing of powerful men in Tucson. This is just the beginning." Naichi translated again, and the chief's expression grew thoughtful. He spoke at length, gesturing occasionally toward the star-filled sky. My grandfather says the spirits have been restless lately. Nietzsche translated. The old ways are ending, whether we fight or flee. Perhaps it is time to seek a new path. What kind of path? He speaks of the reservation at San Carlos. We have resisted, but... Nietzsche's jaw tightened. Perhaps caged birds live longer than free ones hunted by hawks. Sarah's heart ached at the defeat in his voice. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what my people have done. You are not responsible for Morrison's hatred. Nietzsche said softly, no more than I am responsible for the raiders who attacked your people. Around them, the evacuation continued. Sarah watched families gathering their meager possessions, saw the fear in children's eyes, the resignation in their elders' faces. This was survival, stripped of dignity and choice. You must go back, Nietzsche said suddenly. If your father finds you missing, if Morrison learns you warned us, I know. Sarah swallowed hard. But I'm not sorry I came. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. You have a warrior's heart. Sarah Mackenzie. In another world, another time. Don't! She placed her fingers over his lips. We have this moment. Let that be enough. But even as she spoke, they both heard it, the distant rumble of many horses, carried on the still night air. Morrison hadn't waited for dawn. The camp erupted in new urgency. Warriors ran for defensive positions while women and children fled toward the hidden trails leading deeper into the mountains. Nietzsche grabbed his rifle, torn between his duty to defend his people and his desire to see Sarah to safety. Go, she urged. I'll be fine. They won't hurt a white woman. He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, a lifetime of might-have-beens compressed into a single moment. Then he was gone, running to join the other warriors. Sarah found herself swept along with the fleeing families, her mare led by an elderly woman who clutched a baby with her other arm. They climbed narrow trails in the darkness, stones clattering down the mountainside, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Then the shooting started. The crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls, multiplied and magnified until it sounded like the earth itself was breaking apart. Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the valley below, heard the war cries of both sides as they clashed. A young Apache woman stumbled on the trail ahead, her child crying in terror. Sarah dismounted and helped her up, half carrying both mother and child as they struggled higher. Other women did the same, the stronger helping the weaker. No one left behind despite the danger. They reached a series of caves hidden behind a fall of rocks, natural fortresses invisible from below. As the families took shelter, Sarah stood at the entrance, watching the battle rage in the valley. The moon that had seemed so beautiful earlier now illuminated a scene of chaos and death. She thought of her father down there, probably trying to minimize the bloodshed even as Morrison urged greater violence. She thought of Nietzsche, defending his people against impossible odds. She thought of the bitter irony that she stood with the Apache while her own kind attacked, yet knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The shooting continued through the night, sporadic bursts followed by ominous silences. Sarah helped tend the wounded who straggled in, a warrior with a bullet in his shoulder, a woman who'd fallen on the rocks in her flight. She used her petticoats for bandages, her water to clean wounds, her presence to offer what comfort she could to people who had every reason to hate her. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the gunfire finally ceased. Sarah stood at the cave mouth, exhausted and heartsick, watching smoke rise from the destroyed camp below. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, chosen a side in a conflict that allowed no neutrality. But as she felt the weight of the turquoise necklace against her throat, as she heard the quiet prayers of the Apache women behind her, she knew she had also found something precious, the courage to follow her heart, regardless of consequences. The sun rose on a changed world, and Sarah Mackenzie stood ready to face whatever that world might bring. The sacred fire burned at the heart of the circle, its flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like prayers made visible. Sarah stood at the edge of the gathering, her heart pounding as drums began their ancient rhythm, deep and resonant, seeming to rise from the earth itself. 3 days had passed since Morrison's attack. The Apache had regrouped in this higher valley, a place known only to them, where sacred springs bubbled from the rocks and ancient pictographs decorated the canyon walls. The battle had cost them dearly. 5 warriors dead, many wounded, their winter supplies destroyed, but they had survived, and tonight they would perform the ritual of protection and renewal. Naichi appeared at her side, painted for ceremony. Red ochre traced lightning patterns across his chest, and his hair was adorned with eagle feathers. In the firelight, he looked like something from another time, a figure of power and mystery. "You should not be here," he said softly, though his eyes said otherwise. "Where else would I be?" Sarah replied. She had made her choice in those caves, tending wounded Apache while her own people attacked below. There was no going back now. The chief, his weathered face painted with the sacred symbols, raised his arms and began to chant. His voice rose and fell with the drums, words in the old language that probably few of the younger Apache fully understood. But the power was in the sound itself, in the connection to countless generations who had performed these rites. Warriors began to dance, their movements telling stories of battle and hunt, of seasons turning and spirits walking the land. The women added their voices, a haunting harmony that made Sarah's skin prickle with its beauty. Children watched wide-eyed from their mother's arms, absorbing traditions that Morrison and his kind were determined to destroy. "Come," Naichi said, taking her hand. Sarah pulled back. "I shouldn't. This is sacred to your people. Tonight, you are one of us. You have proven your heart." He led her into the circle, and Sarah felt the weight of many eyes upon her. Some faces showed acceptance, others suspicion, but the chief nodded slightly, and the dancing continued. The fire was impossibly hot, casting wild shadows on the canyon walls. Sarah felt sweat bead on her forehead as Naichi guided her in the basic steps: earth and sky, the 4 directions, the eternal cycle of life and death and rebirth. The drums seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. An elderly woman approached, one of the grandmothers Sarah had helped in the caves. She carried a pottery bowl filled with something that gleamed like liquid starlight in the firelight. The woman spoke in Apache, her voice kind but firm. "She offers you the sacred drink," Naichi translated. "It binds you to us, and us to you. But Sarah," his voice grew serious, "once taken, this cannot be undone. You would be Apache in spirit, no matter where your path leads." Sarah looked at the bowl, at the expectant faces around the fire, at Naichi with his painted skin and feathered hair. She thought of her father, probably sick with worry, of Mrs. Pritchard's gossip, of Morrison's hatred. She thought of the life she'd known at the trading post, safe, predictable, slowly suffocating her spirit. She took the bowl and drank. The liquid was bitter, herbal, with an aftertaste like lightning strikes. It burned down her throat and seemed to spread warmth through her entire body. The drums grew louder, or perhaps her hearing grew sharper. The fire seemed to pulse with life, and the stars above spun in slow spirals. Time became fluid. Sarah danced. How long? She couldn't say. She was the desert wind, the patient stone, the brief bloom of a cactus flower. She was every woman who had ever loved across forbidden boundaries, every soul who had chosen courage over comfort. The Apache women danced with her now, their movements teaching her wordlessly how to read the desert's moods, how to find water in dry places, how to be strong and bend without breaking. At some point, the chief's voice rose above the drums, speaking words that needed no translation. His gestures encompassed Sarah and Naichi, the fire, the assembled people. An old woman draped a blanket around Sarah's shoulders, soft doeskin decorated with beadwork. Another pressed a small leather pouch into her hands. Herbs, by the smell. Apache ritual of midnight fire turned a shy frontier virgin into his boundless mate. The words came from everywhere and nowhere, perhaps spoken, perhaps only felt. Sarah understood with sudden clarity that this was more than a ceremony of protection. It was a binding, a recognition of what already existed between her and Naichi, a defiance of the forces trying to tear their worlds apart. Naichi stood before her now, his own expression intense with emotion. He spoke in Apache, then repeated in English. "Before the fire and the people, before earth and sky, I claim you as you have claimed me. Let all who would divide us face the wrath of the spirits." Sarah found herself responding, words coming unbidden, before witnesses seen and unseen. "I choose this path with open eyes and willing heart. Let the fire burn away what was, and forge what will be." A cry went up from the assembled Apache, not the war cry she'd heard during battle, but something triumphant and wild and free. The drumming reached a crescendo, and dancers whirled faster, their movements ecstatic. Then, as suddenly as it had intensified, the energy began to ebb. The fire was allowed to die to embers. The drums softened to a whisper. Families began to drift away to their shelters, but not before many touched Sarah's shoulder or pressed her hand. Acceptance. Welcome. Acknowledgement of her sacrifice and choice. Naichi led her away from the dying fire to a ledge overlooking the valley. The first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, painting the clouds in shades of pearl and rose. Sarah's legs trembled with exhaustion, but her spirit felt impossibly light. "What happens now?" she asked, leaning against his strength. "Now we face the consequences," he replied honestly. "Your people will call you traitor. Mine must decide whether to fight or flee. The army will come, if not Morrison's mob again. But tonight," he pulled her closer. "Tonight, the spirits blessed our union. Whatever comes, we face it together." Sarah thought of the bitter drink, the wild dancing, the moment when individual self had dissolved into something larger. Was it real, the ritual, or was it just ceremony? Naichi was quiet for a moment. What is real? The papers your people sign in their churches? The words spoken by men in black robes? Or this, he gestured to the fading stars, the eternal mountains, the bond between them that seemed to pulse with its own life? The ritual recognizes what the heart already knows. You were mine from the moment you spoke of water belonging to all. I was yours from the moment I saw past your shy exterior to the warrior within. They sat in silence as the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah knew that by now her father would have discovered her note, would perhaps be leading searchers to find her. She knew that choosing this path meant exile from everything she'd known, that the world would call her fallen, ruined, race traitor. But as she felt the doe-skin blanket warm on her shoulders, tasted the lingering herbs on her tongue, remembered the fierce joy of dancing by firelight, she also knew she had found something worth any price, a love that transcended boundaries, a people who judged her by her heart rather than her skin, a purpose greater than mere survival. The ritual fire had died to ashes, but its truth burned eternal. The shy frontier virgin was gone, transformed by flame and choice into something stronger, wilder, free. And as Naichi's arms encircled her, as the new day broke over the ancient land, Sarah Mackenzie embraced her transformation with the same courage that had brought her riding through the night to save the people who had become her own. The Apache ritual of midnight fire had done its work, binding two souls across the divide of race and culture, forging something new from the ashes of the old. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together, boundless mates in a world that would test their bond with every breath, but could never break what the sacred fire had joined. The attack came at dawn, 5 days after the midnight fire ceremony. Sarah woke to the crack of rifles and the thunder of horses, Morrison's men pouring into the hidden valley like a plague of locusts. She grabbed the rifle Naichi had taught her to use and ran from their shelter, her heart pounding with terror and rage. The battle was chaos incarnate. Warriors scrambled for defensive positions while women and children fled toward the canyon's narrow exits. But Morrison had learned from his previous failure. This time he'd brought 60 men, and they'd sealed off the escape routes during the night. Sarah saw Naichi racing toward the front lines and started after him, but strong hands pulled her back. 2 Apache women dragged her toward the temporary shelter where the wounded were already being brought. "No!" She struggled against them, I need to help fight. You help here, one of the women said in broken English. Save lives, not take them. The next hours blurred together in a nightmare of blood and gunpowder. Sarah worked frantically alongside the Apache women, pressing cloth to wounds, offering water to the dying, trying not to think about Naichi out there in the fighting. The cave filled with wounded warriors with bullets in their flesh. Women caught in crossfire. A child whose arm hung at an unnatural angle. Through the cave entrance, she could see the battle raging. The Apache fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered 3-1. Morrison's men had better positions, more ammunition, and the cruel advantage of surprise. Then she saw him, her father, riding with Morrison's group but holding back, his rifle unfired. Even from a distance, she could see the anguish on his face as he searched the battlefield. Looking for her. Papa, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. A warrior stumbled into the cave, clutching his stomach where red bloomed across his shirt. As Sarah rushed to help him, she realized with cold shock that it was Naichi. His face was gray with pain, his breathing shallow. No, 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 she sobbed, pressing her hands against the wound. Stay with me, please, stay with me. He managed to focus on her face. Sarah, my boundless mate. Don't talk, save your strength. She worked frantically, using everything the Apache women had taught her, but the wound was too deep, too much damage. Outside, the gunfire was lessening. Morrison's voice carried across the battlefield. Surrender. Come out with your hands visible, and we'll show mercy. Mercy, one of the old women spat. White man's mercy is a bullet instead of rope. The chief appeared at the cave entrance, his arm hanging useless at his side, blood painting the left side of his face. He spoke rapidly in Apache, and Sarah caught enough to understand. They were beaten. To continue fighting meant annihilation. We must surrender, Naichi whispered, his hand finding Sarah's. Save who we can. You'll be all right, Sarah insisted. We'll get you to a doctor. A shadow fell across the cave entrance. Jake Morrison stood there, pistol in hand, his eyes taking in the scene. Sarah kneeling beside the wounded Apache warrior, her dress soaked in blood, the turquoise necklace visible at her throat. Well, Morrison's voice was cold as winter. The rumors were true. Mackenzie's daughter has gone native. These people need medical help, Sarah said, not moving from Naichi's side. There are wounded women and children. Savages don't deserve mercy. Morrison raised his pistol, aiming at Naichi, starting with this one. No! Sarah threw herself across Naichi's body. If you want to kill him, you'll have to kill me first. Sarah! Her father appeared behind Morrison, his face haggard. When he saw her, bloodied, protective, clearly choosing the Apache over her own kind. Something broke in his expression. Get away from him, daughter, Thomas said quietly. Come home with me. We'll say you were kidnapped, that they forced you. People will understand. They didn't force me. Sarah raised her chin, meeting his eyes. I chose this. I chose him. I chose them. You don't know what you're saying. Thomas stepped forward. You're confused, frightened. I've never been clearer about anything in my life. Morrison laughed. An ugly sound. She's ruined. Mackenzie, contaminated. No decent white man will have her now. A shot rang out. For a terrified moment, Sarah thought Morrison had fired. Then she saw the smoking rifle in her father's hands, pointed at the ground near Morrison's feet. The next one goes in your chest, Jake. Thomas said calmly, lower your weapon. You're defending these murderers? Your own daughter has betrayed her race, and you. My daughter showed more courage than any of us. Thomas interrupted. She tried to prevent bloodshed while we brought more. Now lower your weapon before I forget we were once neighbors. Morrison's face contorted with rage. But other men were gathering, drawn by the confrontation. Some sided with Morrison. Others looked uncertain. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then a new sound cut through the tension cavalry bugles. Growing closer, the army had finally arrived. What followed was controlled chaos. The soldiers, led by a Captain Reynolds Sarah vaguely recognized, took charge with military efficiency. The Apache were disarmed and gathered under guard. The wounded were tended by an army doctor who worked without regard to race, much to Morrison's vocal disgust. Sarah refused to leave Nietzsche's side as the doctor examined him. The prognosis was grim, but not hopeless. The bullet had missed vital organs by inches. With proper care, he might survive. "This woman needs to be arrested," Morrison demanded, pointing at Sarah. "She's a traitor. She's a civilian who provided medical aid during a conflict." Captain Reynolds cut him off. "I see no crime in that." As Nietzsche was loaded onto a travois for transport, he gripped Sarah's hand weakly. "The ritual cannot be undone. You are Apache now. My people will remember, and I'll make sure they're treated fairly." She promised. "I won't let Morrison win." Her father approached as the Apache were being moved out. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the divide that had opened between them. "I failed you," Thomas finally said. "I should have sent you away sooner. Should have protected you from this. You taught me to see people as people, not as colors or tribes." Sarah interrupted. "You taught me that water belongs to everyone. How is this not the fruition of those lessons?" Thomas's eyes were wet. "Because the world doesn't work that way. Daughter, because choosing love across these lines brings nothing but sorrow." Sarah touched the turquoise necklace, thinking of the midnight fire, of Nietzsche's touch, of the brief glimpse she'd had of what could be if hatred didn't poison everything. "Then I'll take whatever sorrow comes," she said. "It's better than living a lie." The sun was setting as the long column began moving. Apache prisoners headed for the reservation. Wounded carried on litters. Morrison's vigilantes sullen under military supervision. Sarah walked beside Nietzsche's travois, her father on his horse nearby, neither defending nor condemning her choice. She thought of the chief's words about caged birds living longer than free ones. Perhaps that was true, but as she looked at the Apache faces around her, proud even in defeat, unbroken despite everything, she knew that some cages were made of more than iron bars. Some were made of fear, of hatred, of the inability to see common humanity across surface differences. The midnight fire ritual had freed her from those invisible cages. Whatever price she paid for that freedom, whatever sorrow lay ahead, she would face it with the same courage these people had shown. She was Apache now in all but blood, bound by fire and choice and love to a people the world insisted she should fear. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah heard one of the old women begin to sing, a mourning song for the dead, but also a song of continuance, of survival against all odds. Other voices joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Sarah didn't know all the words, but she hummed along, adding her voice to theirs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the reservation, the army's rules, Morrison's continued hatred, her father's disappointment, but tonight, walking beside the man she loved, surrounded by the people who'd accepted her, she was exactly where she belonged. The attack had failed to break them. Morrison had won the battle but lost the war for Sarah's soul. And somewhere in the spirit world, the midnight fire still burned, testament to a love that refused to recognize the boundaries drawn by frightened men. The town of Copper Creek fell into an uneasy silence in the weeks following the battle. Morrison and his supporters had been censured by the Army Tribunal, though no real punishment was handed down beyond stern warnings about vigilante justice. The Apache were confined to the San Carlos Reservation, their freedom exchanged for the dubious safety of government protection. Sarah stood on the hill overlooking the cemetery, wildflowers clutched in her hands. The wooden cross marking her father's grave was still fresh. The earth barely settled. Thomas Mackenzie had died 3 days after the battle, his heart giving out as he helped treat the wounded at the army post. Some said it was the strain of recent events. Sarah knew it was a broken heart, torn between love for his daughter and the weight of community judgment. "He loved you until the end," a voice said behind her. She turned to find Captain Reynolds, his uniform dusty from the ride. "Captain," He asked me to give you this. Reynolds handed her a leather-wrapped package. Said he'd been saving it for when you married, but... He gestured helplessly at the circumstances that made a traditional wedding impossible. Inside was her mother's Bible and a deed to the trading post. A note in her father's shaky handwriting read, "The water belongs to everyone. Daughter, so does love. Forgive a foolish old man his fears." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she pressed the Bible to her chest. "Thank you for bringing this. There's something else," Reynolds said uncomfortably. "The Apache at San Carlos, they're not doing well. The agent there, Butterfield, he's not a kind man. Your friend, the warrior Naichi, his wound has festered. The doctor won't treat Indians unless forced." Sarah's head snapped up. "Take me there." "Miss Mackenzie, Sarah, you know I can't do that. Civilians aren't allowed on the reservation without special permission." "Then get me permission." "It's not that simple. After what happened, your name, Morrison, has been spreading stories. They're calling you Apache Sarah in town, and not kindly. The Indian agent won't want you stirring up trouble." Sarah thought of Naichi's suffering, of the proud Apache people caged like animals, of promises made beside a midnight fire. "Then I'll go without permission." Reynolds sighed. "I didn't hear that. But if someone were to travel with the mission ladies who visit weekly to teach Christianity, well, Agent Butterfield can hardly refuse good Christian women trying to save heathen souls." 3 days later, Sarah sat in a wagon with 4 stern-faced missionary women, her hair severely pulled back, her dress the dull brown of their order. She'd sold most of her possessions to buy medical supplies, hidden now beneath Bibles and hymn books. The San Carlos reservation was a vision of hell. The Apache, people of the mountains and high desert, had been forced onto flat, malarial land along the Gila River. Crude shelters replaced their traditional wickiups. Proud warriors stood in line for meager government rations. Children with hollow eyes watched the wagon pass. "Heavens," one of the mission ladies whispered. "They look so defeated." Sarah bit back her response. These women meant well, but they couldn't see past their own assumptions to the systematic destruction of a people. She found Naichi in what passed for an infirmary, a wooden shed with no windows and a dirt floor. He lay on a thin blanket, his wound seeping through dirty bandages, fever painting his skin with an unhealthy shine. "Naichi," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty. "Sarah, you should not be here." "Hush." She began unwrapping the neglected wound, fighting nausea at the infection she found. "I'm exactly where I should be." Working quickly, she cleaned the wound with carbolic acid, applied the herbal poultices the Apache women had taught her to make, and rewrapped it with clean bandages. Other Apache began gathering, watching in wonder as a white woman tended their warrior with gentle hands. "The missionary says no treating the savages," a harsh voice announced. Agent Butterfield stood in the doorway, a small man whose cruel eyes belied his bureaucratic appearance. "They get what the government provides, nothing more. The government provides inadequate care," Sarah replied, not pausing in her work. "I'm supplementing with Christian charity. You're that Mackenzie girl, the Indian lover." Butterfield's smile was unpleasant. "Morrison told me all about you, how you've gone native, participated in their heathen rituals." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I've provided medical care to human beings in need. If that makes me a heathen, then I'll answer to God for it. Not to you. Get out, now, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing on federal land." Sarah finished tying off the bandage and stood slowly. She'd done what she could for now. As she gathered her supplies, she spoke in Apache quietly, but loud enough for those gathered to hear, "I will return. The fire still burns." Understanding rippled through the Apache faces. The midnight fire ritual, they knew what she meant, what she was to Naichi, what promises had been made. Over the following months, Sarah waged a quiet war against the reservation system. She sold the trading post to a fair-minded German immigrant and used the money to fund supplies for San Carlos. She wrote letters to newspapers in Tucson and San Francisco, detailing the conditions. She haunted the territorial government, demanding investigations into Agent Butterfield's corruption. And she visited, whenever she could slip past the restrictions, sometimes with the missionaries, sometimes disguised as a supply wagon driver, once memorably hidden among cattle being delivered to the agency. Each time, she brought medicine, food, news from the outside world, and most importantly, hope. Nietzsche slowly recovered, though he would always carry the scars. On one of her visits, he pulled her aside. "You should stop coming," he said. "Build a new life. Forget. Sarah touched the turquoise necklace she still wore. "Forget the midnight fire. Forget my boundless mate. I think not. I can offer you nothing now. No freedom, no future. Only—" She silenced him with a kiss. "You offer me yourself. That's all I ever wanted." Word of her activities eventually reached Morrison, who tried to have her arrested for sedition. But Captain Reynolds, promoted to major now, intervened. The Army, he argued, had bigger concerns than one woman's humanitarian efforts. The tide was slowly turning. A new Indian agent replaced Butterfield after one too many reports of corruption. Conditions improved marginally. Some Apache were allowed to leave the reservation for seasonal work. It wasn't freedom, but it was a crack in the cage. On a warm spring evening, a year after the battle, Sarah stood once again on a hilltop, but this time, she wasn't alone. Nietzsche stood beside her, temporary permission papers in his pocket, looking out over the desert they both loved. "Your father was right," he said quietly. "Choosing love across these lines has brought you sorrow." Sarah leaned into his strength, and joy, and purpose, and an understanding of what really matters. In the distance, smoke rose from the reservation. Not the smoke of destruction, but cook fires, life continuing despite everything. The Apache people endured, adapted, survived. And Sarah had found her place among them, not Apache by blood, but by choice, by trial, by a love that refused to recognize the boundaries others drew. The world changes slowly. Nietzsche said, "Perhaps our children will see better days." Our children. Sarah looked up at him, hope blooming in her chest. He smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face. "The mission ladies insist I must marry you in their church to make an honest woman of you. I thought the midnight fire had already done that, but you'll humor them? I'll do whatever keeps you safe, whatever allows us to be together." As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah thought of all that had led to this moment. Her father's death, the violence and hatred, the long struggle against injustice. All of it had tested her but not broken her. The shy frontier virgin was long gone, transformed by trial and choice into someone stronger. The Apache ritual of midnight fire had marked the beginning of her transformation, but every day since had been a choice to honor that commitment. Love alone wasn't enough to bridge two worlds. It took courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that common humanity mattered more than skin color or culture. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The reservation system wouldn't end overnight. Prejudice wouldn't vanish with wishful thinking. But tonight, standing with her boundless mate overlooking the eternal desert, Sarah knew she'd found something worth every struggle, a love that transcended boundaries, a purpose that gave meaning to suffering, and a people who'd shown her what real strength looked like. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed the midnight fire ritual. The same stars that had guided Apache people for countless generations. Under their ancient light, two souls from different worlds stood united. Proof that love could grow even in the harshest ground. That hope could survive even the darkest times. The water belonged to everyone. So did the capacity for understanding, for growth, for choosing love over fear. Sarah Mackenzie had learned that truth in the most difficult way possible. But as Nietzsche's arms encircled her, as the desert wind carried the faint sound of drums from the reservation, she knew she wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had brought her here. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this journey through the untamed frontier of the human heart. If you're listening to this story right now, whether you're driving through the vast highways of America, sitting by your fireplace on a cold evening, or perhaps taking a break from your daily routine, we'd love to hear from you. Please comment below and let us know where in the world you're experiencing this tale of love and courage. Subscribe to our channel From Wild West for more authentic stories from America's frontier era. And share your thoughts about Sarah and Naichi's journey. Did their love transcend the boundaries of their time? What would you have done in their place? Your insights make our community richer, and we can't wait to hear from listeners across the globe. Until next time, keep riding toward your own horizons. Partners,